Hey everyone, my name is Kenny Kang, and along with Sabrina Dunham, we will be helping lead the first lecture of your class this semester. In this slide set, we will be talking about Pharmaco Economics as well as the FDA drug approval process. You have some other pre-class recordings that will provide some great information on various aspects of pharmacokinetics and pharmacodynamics and other topics being covered in this first lecture. But we hope you find this useful, and we look forward to speaking with you all in class. So first, what is pharmacoeconomics? It can be generally defined as the analysis of costs and consequences of any healthcare-related treatment or service. This can include medications, this can include diagnostic tests, this can include various surgical procedures. And our goal here is to evaluate drug treatments in terms of comparing the value of each treatment to each other. And overall, in healthcare, we like to think of the value that we're providing as quality divided by the cost of the treatment of choice. So within pharmacoeconomics, there are a multitude of factors that affect how we analyze the cost, the efficacy, and how we conduct these type of studies. So first, we always want to look at the clinical efficacy and its effect on the patient, as well as the safety aspects of the treatment. We also want to look at adverse drug reactions. We want to look at hospital admissions and whether a treatment can help or reduce hospital admissions, as there are costs tied to those. We want to assess the patient's quality of life. We want to look at different economic outcomes, such as costs, including direct, indirect, and intangible costs. We want to look at the total cost of the treatment itself directly, as well as any ancillary treatment and other associated costs with the main treatment, and a multitude of other factors as well that can be included in various pharmacoeconomic studies. So one important thing with pharmacoeconomics to consider that is a little different than some of the scientific literature that you may have seen in the past in your experience as nurses is the point of view. So in our example, there are three main point of views that pharmacoeconomic studies can come from. The first being the payer. These are your insurance companies and your government payers, such as Medicare and Medicaid. They're going to look at the economic value of a treatment or a test a lot differently than a provider, someone who's taking care of the patient and providing the frontline care. And they still even may look at it differently than a patient, the patient who ultimately has to bear the brunt of the cost. And each patient may value something differently as far as what a treatment brings to them versus the adverse effects that it also brings to them. And then in addition to those points of views, the costs that we look at in pharmacoeconomic studies are also very important. Obviously, there's always direct costs. What's the exact cost of the drug? What's the exact cost of the test that the patient or the insurance is going to have to pay for? But then there are a lot of indirect costs, as well as intangible costs, costs that we just can't truly measure. And we'll discuss some of these moving forward. So with pharmacoeconomics, there are 5 different types of studies and analyses that we can do. The first is a cost of illness analysis. This is a very general analysis looking at the total cost of any disease within a population. So for example, if we wanted to look at heart failure patients, maybe we would tie up all the intangible costs, the indirect costs, and the direct costs of all of our heart failure patients in the United States, and that would be the cost of illness. Second, we have cost minimization analysis. This is an analysis that you can do when you assume that 2 different treatments are equally as efficacious as each other. In this way, what we do is we assign costs to the treatments and essentially assess which one is cheaper, knowing that they are going to produce the same effect. For the next 3 types of analysis, the cost effectiveness, the cost benefit, as well as the cost utility, it is best to think about how the analysis is analyzing the cost side of things as well as the benefit side of things. So here's what I mean by that. For cost effectiveness, you're essentially looking at treatments that you don't necessarily think are effective. For the costs, you can just use dollars as your unit of measure, and how much does it truly cost for that treatment and for that test. But for the benefits, you may use a different parameter. You may use a unit of measure that is directly related to the disease state. For example, hypertension, we may choose to use the decrease in systolic blood pressure. And through that, for each treatment, we can decide how much does it cost per 1 unit decrease of the systolic blood pressure, and that would be a cost effectiveness analysis. For cost benefit, what we're looking at is that the cost side is in dollars and we want to assess the benefit in dollars. This is a little bit more difficult as benefits are often perceived, and trying to say that I feel so and so better, or I feel my blood pressure has decreased by so and so amount, doesn't necessarily translate exactly to a dollar amount. However, we do our best within these studies to figure out appropriate translation. And finally, cost utility analysis are looking at cost again in dollars, but the benefit this time is measured in utility, or quality adjusted life years. And this quality adjusted life year is often referred to as QALY, Q-A-L-Y, is a measure of the quality of life that the patient is having. Again, this is a difficult measure to try to assess since it is perceived and can vary very much from patient to patient. But it does present a different outlook on how we are measuring pharmacoeconomics, as not just a dollar amount, but truly how is the patient feeling and how is the patient living day to day. So that briefly covers the main types of studies and analyses that can be done in pharmacoeconomics. Again, this is a very surface level view. We can discuss deeper in class if you have more questions, but it gives you a general idea of how in healthcare we try to evaluate the costs that are associated with the various treatments we have. And even though it's a touchy subject, it's something that it is important to consider to make sure that we bring the best value to our patients. So next we'll briefly talk about Medicare coverage. Medicare is the main federal government payer for adults over the age of 65. Now that age can change in the future, and it does cover some other special populations as well, and the coverage can change from year to year. Now Medicare is divided into different parts. There's Part A, Part B, Part C, and Part D. For the purposes of this class, it is important to know that for drug coverage, that is Part D, D for drug. What's interesting about the Part D coverage, though, and this is something that you'll see a lot with your patients when you start prescribing medications, is that there's this thing called the donut hole. So as with any insurances, different plans may have deductibles and co-pays and other things that are coming out of the pocket from the patient, whereas the insurance itself, in this case Medicare, can cover and pick up the rest. However, at a certain dollar amount that can change from year to year, there is this thing called the donut hole. Essentially, when you reach that certain dollar amount that you've spent on the year, the insurance is no longer covering you. So you're paying everything out of pocket, and essentially your drug expense goes through the roof. And then that donut hole exists for a certain amount of dollars, and then if you then reach a second threshold, you can actually leave the donut hole and qualify for something called catastrophic coverage. Some patients may never leave the donut hole. They may reach the donut hole and reach that preset amount around September, and then they don't get out of it in December. So September through December, everything's out of pocket before it resets in January. Of note, the donut hole has been shrinking over the previous years, and the plan is for it to disappear in the coming year. So it's not something you may necessarily need to worry about when you actually get out of practice as nurse practitioners. So briefly, I just wanted to present a slide on a few other cost considerations that will be important when working with your patients in the future. So the first is brand versus generic. And some patients don't always understand the difference, and some patients may think incorrectly that generics aren't as effective. But really, generics and brands are pretty much the same, and in fact, they have to be bioequivalent and pharmacologically equivalent for the generic to be approved. This means that all your pharmacodynamic and pharmacokinetic parameters must be equivalent to the brand in verified studies, and the active ingredient or the main drug ingredient has to be the same. And generics are typically cheaper. The next concept here with insurance, we briefly talked about it with Medicare, but it is important to know that Medicare doesn't cover everybody. It's a large payer in many of our health systems, but there's also Medicaid, there's private insurances, and a whole gamut of different programs within various private insurances. So typically, insurances will have different tiers on how they cover medications and will almost always prefer generics over brand. So what will happen is there will be a tier 1, which is your preferred generics that, they may be able to get for a patient at a $10 copay. Then you have tier 2, which could include some preferred brand medications. These are brand medications that may not have a generic, and it's the only option for these patients. They'll be a little bit more expensive, but still covered to some extent. Maybe the copay will be like $25. It really depends on the insurance. Then you go to non-preferred brands. So these are brands that the insurance company doesn't want you to use, and may require actually some loopholes and prior authorizations for you to even be able to prescribe it for the patient. And these are going to be even more expensive. And most insurances now will also have a tier 4, which is for specialty medications. Typically, all insurances will publish the tiers online, so you can quickly do a search and figure out if a certain medication will be covered one way or the other. And finally, one last cost consideration is that almost all your major retailers, Walgreens, CVS, Walmart, are going to have their own individual cheap drug list. For example, the $4 list. These lists are constantly being updated, and honestly, they don't always have the most efficacious option of the medication on this list. But if your patient can't cover anything else, this is something that you can look at, especially if they don't have insurance, just to get them a cheap option and at least get something of efficacy on board. All right, so that was a lot of the discussions on cost. We'll transition real quick into one last slide of information here on the drug approval process, just so you can get a general overview of how drugs actually come to market. This is a pretty extensive process and costs millions and millions of dollars to get even a single drug approved, and is overseen by the Food and Drug Administration. So what drug companies have to do is they have to start by identifying a chemical compound that they think will produce some kind of effect in the body. And they have to start by studying that compound in some preclinical trials, so animals and lab testing. If those results are positive, they can apply to the FDA and say, all right, we want to start testing in human volunteers now. And the FDA will say, okay, and you can proceed with the studies, and you move to phase 1 trials. These are very early trials, and they are evaluating just the safety in a small population of healthy human volunteers. If the safety is verified and it looks like the adverse effects are tolerable for what the drug is trying to do, we move on to phase 2 trials. And at this point, we're looking at both safety and efficacy in a small sample of patients who actually present with the disease. If the trial at that point still seems successful, you can move into phase 3 trials. These are the larger trials, still measuring safety and efficacy, but they have large populations. They're randomized oftentimes. They have blinding. They're very strict and structured trials. And these are the trials that will ultimately be presented to the FDA when the approval process comes about. Finally, if those phase 3 trials are successful and the FDA approves the medication, it can come onto market. However, trials don't just stop there. There may still be phase 4 trials after approval. These are trials that maybe the FDA said, all right, we'll approve it because your trials show you have good efficacy, but we're still a little bit concerned about maybe this adverse event. So we want you to do just a couple more trials, and these can be ongoing for many years after approval to gather more and more comprehensive data. Each of these steps, like I mentioned, can take a few years. For the number of drugs that get approved, there are 10 times as many drugs that don't get approved. So again, very time-consuming, very expensive process. But ultimately, this is how we have all the medications that we have on our market. All right, thank you everyone for your time and attention, and we look forward to seeing you in class.